Warhammer 40K has a massive problem, one in which nothing but a generous helping of plot armor has any hope of actually fixing. I'm of course talking about the Tyranid problem. Now on one hand, you have this seemingly ridiculously overpowered faction, one that can basically do anything and outnumbers humanity some 10,000 to 1. Yet time and time again, they fail to make any kind of actual impact on the setting. We've got a faction that on paper is so god tier that they're likely to destroy the entire galaxy in less than 1,000 years. Yet every single time they get even remotely close to eating a world that anybody actually cares about, they get miraculously defeated. The plot having to resort to Deus Ex literal corn demons at one point in order to push them back. So what exactly is going on here? What is the deal with the Tyranids? Are they actually too overpowered for Warhammer 40K, and is Games Workshop having to do some narrative course correction? Or are they nowhere near as powerful as a large portion of the community seems to think, and their defeat is nothing out of the ordinary? If they are as powerful as the makers of Warhammer 40K keep telling us they are, then why aren't we seeing any more meaningful Tyranid victories? We're gonna dive into all that and a whole lot more in this video, as there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the Tyranid problem. But first, a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video, Dungeon Hunter 6.
Dungeon Hunter 6 is the latest entry in the iconic Dungeon Hunter franchise, and I remember when this series first kicked off in 2009. I'm completely blown away by how far it's come. Dungeon Hunter 6 is a free-to-play mobile ARPG, characterized by its stunning fantasy-inspired art style and unique hero collector feature. The game has tons of different builds and skills you can utilize to hack and slash your way through hordes of enemies and some truly over-the-top bosses. The game is absolutely free to play, and you can download it now by clicking on the link in the description of this video, or if you're on PC, by scanning my QR code on the screen. My favorite part about the game is that even though you feel a huge sense of triumph after conquering one of the game's many bosses, that's not the end. Not only do you get their loot, but you can use them as mounts, summon them onto the battlefield as part of your squad, and even shapeshift into them to harness their crazy levels of power in the end game. It's a super unique mechanic that I've never seen anyone else do before, and there's over 100 uniquely designed bosses to conquer, as well as new classes and units being updated monthly, so the fun never ends. Download the game for free today on both Android and iOS by clicking on the link in the description of this video, or scanning my QR code on the screen for my PC viewers. When you do, you'll get a special starter pack worth $50. That includes 10 summoning scrolls, 1 SSR Lieutenant, the Demonic Wolf, and 1 accessory pack. And don't forget to use your game account to enter the Launch Lucky Spin event for free to win some great prizes like a iPhone 15 Pro Max, a PS5, or even an Apple Watch. The event starts October 15th. Check out the description in this video for all the details. Big thanks to Dungeon Hunter 6 for sponsoring this video. When somebody first gets into Warhammer, the first thing they notice is just how ridiculously overpowered all of the factions seemingly are. But if it's a franchise that you end up liking and you stick with it, you realize that they're all balanced out by a copious amount of weaknesses that keep them in line with the rest of the story. But considering that the Tyranids really don't seem to have any major glaring weaknesses compared to all of the other factions, it's no wonder that we see hot takes all the time from people saying that Games Workshop has written themselves into a corner with them, that they made them too powerful for this setting, and the only thing that will prevent a complete Tyranid victory is the dreaded plot armor. On paper, we can certainly see where these people are coming from. The Tyranids really do seem to have everything going for them. They fight as an infinite swarm, seemingly outnumbering humanity some 10,000 to 1. They can harvest the DNA from other creatures to create the ultimate bioforms, adapting and evolving in radically different directions, seemingly on the fly to counter whatever the enemy could possibly throw at them. They are united entirely under the will of the hive mind, one central godlike intelligence, thus they are all on the same page at all times. And considering the fact that they come from outside of our galaxy, many people believe that the Tyranids we've seen so far are only the scouts, the tiniest portion of the entirety of the Tyranid species. When they invade a world, they don't only kill every single person on it, but harvest every scrap of organic matter, including all of their own dead, render it down into biomass, and then use that to make even more Tyranids. So whenever they win, they don't actually lose any of their units, but will often walk away from the fight, potentially doubling or even tripling their numbers, whereas everybody else in this universe has to lick their wounds and rebuild the old-fashioned way. It sounds pretty ridiculous, right? Like they should be destroying major planets and absolutely tearing the Imperium apart. But that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it's far more common in the stories to see the Tyranids get absolutely stomped rather than win any meaningful victories. So what the hell is actually going on? If the Tyranids are so ungodly broken, why haven't they absolutely crushed the Imperium and rendered everyone down into bug food yet? Part 1. Can the Tyranids actually be beaten? Let's get this out of the way before diving into the meat and potatoes of this video. Are the Tyranids as a faction too OP for Warhammer 40K? No, they absolutely are not. It's been proven time and time again that they are not invincible, they can be defeated, and it's to the point where we honestly see them get their ass handed to them more often than not. The one factor that they have that does make them a little bit OP though, is that since we don't have any confirmation on just how many Tyranids are actually out there, and how many more of them are lurking beyond the boundaries of our galaxy, they exist more like a force of nature than a faction. I'm just gonna say it right now, the Tyranids are here to stay. They're just something that the Milky Way galaxy will have to deal with for the rest of time. This is not something that is unique to them, however, as the Orcs are also a faction that reproduces so quickly that you can never truly get rid of them. And if we want to pull in a little Games Workshop magic, even a faction like the Necrons, of which there are far fewer of, could potentially have hundreds of billions of unactive tomb worlds waiting to come online, considering that they supposedly had spread to every corner of the galaxy during the War in Heaven. In battle, the Tyranids have weaknesses just like everybody else that can be exploited. Since they're all controlled by the hive mind, the Tyranids have unity unlike any other faction. But the hive mind doesn't have any naysayers to question its decisions, and time again, it has been shown to make rash choices, perhaps due to an overconfidence in its own superiority, that have come back to bite it. There was a scene in the Devastation of Baal where the Blood Angels created a moat of thirst water, a liquid comprised of microorganisms that suck all of the water out of anything that they touch. The Tyranid swarm ended up throwing itself into the water in great numbers, all of them dying instantaneously. Now, whether it thought it could survive or that it would just fill the moat with so many bodies that it would eventually make a bridge of bone and chitin is unknown, but ultimately it didn't work out for it. Additionally, since the entirety of the Tyranid network is controlled by synapse creatures, if this synaptic network is ever compromised, then the Tyranids revert back into feral beasts. Creatures that are certainly still dangerous, but they're no longer an organized threat, and no match for the highly disciplined military forces of the Imperium. There's also the issue of the Norn Queens, which act like a super synapse creature that controls an entire hive fleet. The queens are so critically important to the fleet that they have to dedicate a large portion of their biomass to keeping her protected in orbit, generating multiple hive ships that stay behind and don't participate in the fighting, because if she ends up getting killed, her death scream will cause all of the Tyranids in the area to start evolving in thousands of different directions at once, leading to a pretty gruesome and spectacular death. There's also the limitations of biomass. Now, even though the Tyranids have access to seemingly infinite different varieties of bioforms, organic war gear, and bioadaptations of all shapes and sizes, each and every one of these things requires biomass, and hive fleets don't have an unlimited supply of the stuff. The hive mind has to pick and choose exactly what combinations of adaptations it's going to send with its troops into battle. It can't just give them all of them. I'm making up numbers here, but it has to decide if it wants to deploy 20 Carnifexes or 1,000 Gaunts, because they require the same amount of biomass. Which one of these things is going to be more effective against this particular enemy in this particular situation? Does it give its units acid maws or feeder tendrils? Are they going to be fighting in an environment where they could utilize camouflage, or is it a waste of biomass? How much armor is the enemy using? Do they need to spend the extra biomass on crushing claws? Is the enemy heavily fortified? Do they need to bring a bunch of burrowing units, or could that biomass better be spent elsewhere? The Tyranids may have an answer for everything, but they can't utilize everything at their disposal in every single engagement, and sometimes they get it wrong. They can quickly adapt to whatever situation they find themselves in and send in a new wave of Tyranid organisms with different adaptations better suited for this particular engagement. But if the enemy is able to change tactics just as quickly, the second wave is likely to be defeated as well. Each time a new wave is sent in and defeated, more and more biomass is lost, until eventually the hive mind has to cut its losses and retreat. There was actually a pretty perfect example of this happening when the Tau fought against Hive Fleet Gorgon, and it became a glorified arms race. The Tau's ability to churn out new tech and fighting tactics versus Gorgon's accelerated evolution. At first, the Tau utilized the dense forests of their world to their advantage by filling them with Kroot-based guerrilla-style combat units that slowed down the Tyranids' movement. The Tyranids responded by evolving to be better suited to move through the forest undeterred. So the Tau switched from using Kroot to fire warriors with pulse rifles, to just obliterate them outright. Once again, the Tyranids evolved to be almost completely immune to the energy created by the pulse rifles, developing carapaces that dissipated the energy of the blast. After this, the Tau would end up retreating to the mountains and sent in stealth teams to gather up all of the fallen Kroot's weapons. They gave them to all of the fire warriors, and they were once again proving effective against the Tyranids. The Tyranids responded to this by sending out a whole bunch of bioforms that had chameleonic abilities and were able to blend into their surroundings, thus making the fire warriors no longer effective. Here's the thing, the advanced enemy detection systems of all of the Tau's battlesuits were able to see their heat signatures no problem, so they just switched to using nothing but crisis suits. The major takeaway here was that since Hive Fleet Gorgon was having to adapt so quickly, it was relying almost entirely on its smaller bioforms. It was never able to deploy any of its big units. And because of this, with a few good old-fashioned suicidal assaults, the Tau were able to go on the aggressive and strike at the heart of the fleet. This is a great example of the Tyranids' limitations. If you can match them tit for tat when it comes to them trying to evolve to counter you, you've got a pretty good chance of coming out victorious. Now, it's easier said than done, and this was certainly a horrifically bloody battle, but the Tau did manage to pull it off in the end. Other factions create some pretty significant problems for the Tyranids as well. Now, although the lore is still unclear on whether or not they can absorb the necrodermis of the Necrons, it's likely that even if they can, they probably don't get much out of it, as they're specialized in absorbing organic matter. Compounding on this even further, the weaponry that the Necrons tend to utilize destroys matter at a molecular level, meaning that the bugs can't even recoup their losses by cannibalizing their own dead. So at the end of the day, from the bugs' perspective, any engagement against the Necrons is ultimately a losing situation, even if they actually win the battle. And when it comes to other factions like Chaos, they can't consume the flesh of demons at all, so it's pretty much the same situation. Now, it's true that the orcs produce an absolute metric ton of biomass for the Tyranids, but they reproduce just as quickly, so engagements with them lead to never-ending wars. And factions like the Eldar are notoriously difficult for their gene-stealer cults to infiltrate. And the forces of the Imperium? They got a shitload of guns. And sometimes the best strategy to fighting the Tyranids is to just have enough ammo to handle wave after wave of bug monsters. Part 2. The Tyranid Problem. Now, even though I just spent the last section of this video describing multiple different ways that the Tyranids can and have been defeated, this is all a lot easier said than done. They're considered the galaxy's apex predator for a reason, and on paper, their small handful of weaknesses pales in comparison to the mountain of strengths that they have. They are by far one of, if not the singular most powerful factions in all of Warhammer 40K. But you wouldn't know this if you were keeping track of their wins and losses. Sure, we see them destroy a bunch of random worlds that no one has ever heard of in the fluff section of their codex, but when it comes to actual meaningful victories, they seem to be non-existent. Why is this the case? Why do the authors of Black Library and the corporate overlords of Games Workshop seem to be completely averse to Tyranid victory? There seems to be a huge disconnect in Warhammer's lore between sources like the codexes, campaign books, and background books, and what we're told about in the novels. On one hand, we are told that the Tyranids are this existential threat, one of the most powerful forces mankind has ever encountered, and they're eating worlds left and right. But then when it comes to the novels, if the Tyranids get even the tiniest bit close to taking a planet that anybody actually gives a shit about, Games Workshop's plot armor kicks in, and the bugs get absolutely stomped. After which, we as the audience are fed this piece of fluff that says that even though the Tyranids didn't ultimately destroy the world, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the Imperium at best. Like, for example, the one from Devastation of Baal, where the Tyranids made it all the way to the Blood Angels' homeworld and eventually were pushed back. Even though they were defeated, we were told that, oh, but things are so bad for the Blood Angels, they suffered uncountable losses and things will never be the same. Except that that's a lie. Everything about that is exactly a lie. Nothing changed. Absolutely nothing changed. You could skip that book in its entirety and you wouldn't even notice that there had been a major invasion of Baal. This is due to a fundamental problem with how Warhammer's story is presented by Games Workshop. Even though this is a setting where mankind controls 1 million worlds, only a couple of dozen of them have any real importance to the story. So a list of destroyed worlds that no one has ever heard of in the timeline section of the Tyranid Codex doesn't resonate with the audience. It is perceived only as an illusion of stakes. It's basically just an exposition dump, something that tells us that they are a threat without showing us through impactful writing that makes the universe feel alive and dangerous. You can actually see a great visual example of this by looking at the new trailer for Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Awesome trailer, loved every second about it, but this last shot genuinely made me crack up. You see Guilliman standing over his console, looking at all these worlds blip out, indicating that they've been consumed by the Tyranids. And even though the whole narrative he's giving is about victory, you see the grimdark reality of just how bad things really are, how many worlds the Tyranids have consumed. This 1 5-second little clip indicating to us as the viewer, oh gosh, things really are bad, aren't they? Yeah, none of those worlds actually mean anything. None of them have any significance in the story at all. It's just another made-up exposition dump. And there's probably a good reason why it doesn't show any of their names on that console, because Guilliman can't name them. And you wanna know why? Because those planets don't exist. They don't exist. However, I understand why Games Workshop handles the bugs like this, and that's because Tyranid victory, I hate to admit it, but it's not very satisfying to read about, at least in the form of a novel. It only really works in that textbook-style format that's delivered through the codexes or the background books. And since Games Workshop has limited themselves to only a handful of planets having any kind of real importance in the setting, they can't let a faction like the Tyranids that has no character or relatable heroes of its own take one of them out. At this point, I've read about 150 of the Warhammer novels, and if you're like me and you consume them at a frankly irresponsible level, then you've probably noticed a pattern with a lot of them, especially any of the books that involve chaos and the Imperium. Although you could objectively call one side over the other the main characters of a given book, they tend to jump back and forth between both factions, really building up the characters on both sides, thoroughly explaining their wants and motivations. This humanizes both sides, and it's the best part about reading a war novel. It builds the immersion and makes deaths on both sides feel meaningful and impactful. You get sucked into the grimdark scenario, and no matter the outcome, the reader is ultimately left satisfied by the conclusion. You just can't do this with the Tyranids. They don't have any character. They don't have any personality other than hunger. This is why, in a novel like Devastation of Baal, the author has to create conflict and drama by having a whole bunch of different factions of Blood Angels who are all technically on the same side, not see eye to eye with each other and end up squabbling through most of the book. I know I'm picking on this book a lot in this video, but I did actually kind of enjoy it, and I think it catches a lot more shit from the audience than it rightfully deserves. I think the lictor scenes in particular were some of the most creative bits of Warhammer writing I've read in a really long time. But let's not mix words. Those lictor scenes were as close as you could possibly get to giving the Tyranids any type of personality. And then even still, we're basically just following an animal. In a novel like this, where the characterization is completely one-sided, you just can't have the Tyranids win. It wouldn't be satisfying to the majority of the audience. Now, full disclosure, I personally would thoroughly enjoy a book like that. Give me a book from the Tyranids' perspective written in the style of Raptor Red, and I'll pre-order the special edition yesterday. But I think the larger Warhammer audience is not going to enjoy something weird and experimental like that, and I'm confident Games Workshop believes this as well. I adore Warhammer's novels, but Games Workshop writes what is going to sell, only taking weird experimental chances every 20 books or so. Oh, what's that? You want the third Rise of the Ynnari book? Well, we need to release about 20 more Horus Heresy books and about 10 more modern Space Marine novels, and give or take 5 or 6 Guard books, and then we'll talk. But even then, no promises. Because Games Workshop has restricted the majority of the setting to only a couple of dozen planets, one of them being destroyed is a massive decision that is not left up to any given author and has to be done at the corporate level. Games Workshop can allow a world like Armageddon to be taken by the Orcs, only for it to later be taken back by the Imperium, and then the Orcs get all pissed and come back again to take it once more. We can have a planet trade hands constantly, and it makes for interesting developments in the overall plot. Warhammer is a fantasy story in space, and in fantasy settings, factions take and lose territory all the time. It's what makes their worlds feel so alive. The problem with the Tyranids is that since they have a scorched earth policy, victory for them means the complete destruction of an entire world. From Games Workshop's perspective, to let the Tyranids win means to cut off thousands of potential storylines stemming from that single planet, and they're not interested in doing that. I should point out that shortly before making this video, the Tyranids did achieve victory at Aughrim. If you don't know about it, the Battle for Aughrim was an event held on Games Workshop's website in mid-2023, where players could submit their results by playing as either the Space Marines or the Tyranids in real games, with the overall victories being calculated at the end to determine the winner. The Tyranids ended up coming out ahead, and thus Aughrim was destroyed. This was awesome. I love these types of events, and I really hope Games Workshop does more Eye of Terror style campaigns like this in the future. But let's not get it twisted. This planet did not exist before this event. The earliest mention of it was from a Warhammer community post announcing the campaign. And who could have asked for a more perfect analogy of what it's like to be a fan of the Tyranids? You get this massive hyped up event that gets the entire community involved, where they finally do it. They finally let the Tyranids win. But it's just a made up planet that no one's ever heard of and doesn't have any lore and doesn't impact the status quo at all. A far cry from the meaningful victory Tyranid fans have been asking for years. What I think is important to bear in mind about 40K and more importantly Games Workshop is that they're a company that doesn't like change. They're notoriously overprotective of the 40K IP and are not traditionally interested in taking risks. It's why, as much as I love the tabletop game, we're playing with a lot of aggressively outdated rules by modern tabletop standards. It's why the status quo of the universe very seldomly changes. You have to remember that this is a company that let the battle for Cadia stand still for almost 2 decades. It's also the company that had to recall the first 2 books in the Dark Imperium trilogy in order to change its dates from happening 112 years in the future, well after the Indomitus Crusade had concluded, to being 12 years into the future while the Crusade was still underway. It was too much of a leap forward for them and changed the status quo just too much. Hell, the only major character death that we've seen recently has been Yarick. And don't get me wrong, I was sad when Yarick died, but that dude was ancient, and it was well overdue. And Games Workshop treated it like this old man dying was this pivotal event, patting themselves on the back for embracing something new. Needless to say, I don't think Games Workshop is going to change its policy on making sure nothing changes anytime soon. And as a consequence, we're probably never going to get a truly meaningful Tyranid victory. So after all that, do I think that Games Workshop wrote themselves into a corner by making the Tyranids too powerful? Surprisingly, no. I don't think they're too OP for the setting. But I do think that GW's aversion to taking risks in the form of letting the Tyranids earn a handful of meaningful victories that actually impacts the overall setting is crippling their storytelling potential for them. The Tyranids are ridiculously interesting. There's a lot of really cool stuff that they could do with them, but if they're not willing to ever let them win in a significant way, the audience ends up not taking them seriously. You can't just tell us that they're a massive threat without showing us. Now, I'm no author, but I feel like that's creative writing 101. If Games Workshop wants to continue on their path of making sure the Space Marines take up 90% of all written lore and that the setting is restricted to only a couple of dozen planets, the only way that's going to happen is by letting the Tyranids blow up one of their homeworlds. The thing I personally find so frustrating about how Games Workshop handles the Tyranids is the inconsistencies in how they are written. We are told that they are the inevitable death of the Milky Way. It doesn't matter how many of them you kill, there will always be more Tyranids. Maybe the Imperium will hold out for another 1,000 years, maybe even 10,000 years, but they will take loss after loss after loss, growing weaker and more tired each and every day, all while the tide of Tyranids never ceases, until one day, the foundations break apart, and in one gory final showdown, the Tyranids destroy everything. It plays into the long game of 40K that we're witnessing the death of humanity, that we're witnessing the tales of those times, 1 second to midnight, where humanity thrashes against the dying of the light. It's an inevitability, but a fundamental pillar of what 40K is all about. On paper, this is pretty cool, but it's unsatisfying to the people who enjoy the Tyranids and just want to see them do something interesting. Oh, what's that? You want to see your faction actually do something? Actually accomplish something, and demonstrate that they have some kind of agency in this franchise? That they actually have an impact on the setting? Nah, take solace in the fact that you're going to win off-screen long after the entire franchise has completely burnt out. Enjoy another 6 novels where your quote-unquote ultimate life form, the Swarm Lord, gets his cheeks clapped by the random Space Marine of the week. That shit sucks. And Games Workshop, if you're listening, I know how to fix everything. Just let the Tyranids eat Calth. Everything will be fine, the status quo will be fine, the Tyranids will get a meaningful victory, the Ultramarines have 499 other worlds, everything will be just fine. Just give the Tyranid fans something. But what do you think of all this? Do you think the Tyranids are too overpowered? Do you think that Games Workshop is justified in plot armoring them into irrelevancy? Do you think that not every single victory has to be this big galaxy-defining moment that shakes up the status quo, and that the smaller victories are totally okay? Do you like the way Games Workshop has handled the Tyranids, or do you want something more from them? This video is a little bit different than the normal type of stuff I make. I normally stick to the lore, but in this one I kind of wanted to explore the more meta narrative of how Games Workshop kind of handles factions, and I might do this in the future more often. Anyways, that's all I had to say on this particular topic. Big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.